What we're about to watch is an interview with Walter Murch, one of the greatest film editors in the history of cinema. He edited sound for Godfather 2 and is known for picture editing for Apocalypse Now, The English Patient, The Conversation, and many more narrative films and documentaries. I had the honor of talking to Mr. Murch during the CAMERIMAGE film festival in Poland. He's a brilliant man, the author of my favorite filmmaking book, and I feel extremely lucky that I was able to record this conversation to share with you all. Enjoy! I'd like to start with the question about your approach to standing while editing, because this is something that is quite unique, I think, still these days. So
yes,
can you discuss your philosophy of standing? Why is it better to stand when you edit?
It is unique, but it shouldn't be. More people should do it, I think. The simple answer is that's how I started. That the editing machines in the 1960s that I used were machines that it was best if you stood at them. That gave you the most mobility. Those analog machines were very active. You were using all of your muscles and your feet, your hands were always moving. And I graduated, in a sense, to the Steenbeck and the the German machines, in the early 70s. And there were very good things about them, but you had to sit at them. And I developed what I called Steenbeck neck, because all you're moving was your wrist and punching things. It was the beginning of what we have now with digital control.
Yeah.
So after a few years, I thought, why am I sitting? I'll just raise these machines up in the air. So I built boxes out of very firm wood, and they're very heavy, 300 kilos or something. So we lifted them up, and then I stood. And when I made the transition to digital in the mid-1990s, there was no reason to sit, because it's all virtual, really. It's just computers. And I used an architect's table that my assistant, who had studied in architecture, he suggested this, and I've been using that same table for the last 25, 30 years. The longer answer, not that that's a long answer, but it's film construction and the rhythms of film are a kind of a dance. There's a certain choreography to it. And when you're standing, your whole body, the kinesthesia of your body is fully engaged. So I believe, for me, I feel the rhythms more. And in the past, I've made an analogy that film editing is like a combination of cooking and surgery and orchestra conducting, and none of those people sit to do what they do for the same reason, that time is very important in surgery, in cooking, and in conducting. And whenever time is important, standing is good. Recently, I've also learned that it's better for your health, because even though you are standing, your muscles are doing things. When you sit, the legs are almost dead. And only in the last few years, they have learned that there has always been a secret vessel from the body into the brain that takes lymphatic fluid into the brain and out of the brain. And the lymphatic fluid cleans up the debris that comes between cells. We have two circulatory systems. There's the blood system, which has the heart, and the lymphatic system. Blood is important on a second-by-second basis. If your heart stops within a minute, you're in trouble. Lymphatic system cleans on a matter of days. And so the body did not dedicate a pump for the lymphatic system, and it depends on the flexing of the large muscles to squeeze this fluid around the body. And when you stand, that happens. So for all those reasons, that's why I stand. But there are many articles now on the internet. If you look up, your chair is your enemy, they say.
Sitting is a new smoking, right? I wonder if you have developed some practices in editing bay to stay productive. Is it something that you thought about actively, or maybe not so much?
Sure. There has historically been a difference between European films and American films. And the tendency in Europe, until perhaps recently, has been to shoot the film, but not to edit it until the film is completely shot. And then you start from the beginning and put it together. It's a very logical way to work. The United States, America, for some business reason to do with money, obviously, they want to compress everything. And so even though the film is shot out of sequence in kind of a crazy order, we have to edit as the film is shooting. So on day 6 of the shoot, we may find ourselves editing the beginning and the ending of a film. But we don't know what the middle is yet. So editing at that stage is a best guess about how it might be based on the screenplay. So the goal is to have the editing done within a week of the shooting. So once the film is finished shooting, a week later, we can show an assembly. Is that the best way? I don't know, but it's certainly the way mostly that I have worked. And so you're very conscious of schedule because they are shooting and I have to keep up with them. On the other hand, you want to do the best job possible. And my particular approach is to make the editing, the first assembly, to be almost a finished. I put a lot of work into making it look good. It's not just throwing things together. And that takes time. I have sometimes hit that mark of a week, but sometimes it's been 3 or 4 weeks, and that drives the producers crazy. But hopefully when they see it, they realize it's much further along than they had hoped.
I've heard an analogy that you don't want edit notes, you want story notes once you're done with the first assembly, right? You've mentioned, I know that, for example, Tom Cruise, the editor of Daniel Chazelle's movie, right? He likes to edit the last scene first, because he says that, once you know what you're leading towards in the editing, it makes things better, easier.
Right. I was at a panel with Richard Harris, who was one of the editors on Titanic. And they asked Richard, they said, what's your system of editing a scene? And he said, I choose the last shot of the scene and then work backwards to the front of the scene, which is a version of what you're saying, but applied within the scene. My peculiarity is that I edit without sound, so that when I'm editing even a dialogue scene, I watch the body language and the lips. I know what they're saying. In a sense, I make myself willingly deaf so that I pay much more attention to these micro expressions and body language. And then when I've assembled the scene and maybe even done a series of changes, then I'll turn on the sound. Mostly it's correct, but sometimes it's wrong and then I have to fix that. But other times it's a chance juxtaposition of a sound that is actually very good. And that's also a general approach to how I work. I like to be prepared, but on the other hand, I like that preparation to allow chance to enter in to the process. Because for some reason, those moments that happen by chance are more magical because the audience doesn't feel the intention behind them. They seem to grow organically out of the mood, of the shot and the mood of the actor and the scene itself. I mean, D.D. Allen, the famous American editor of the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, her process was exactly the opposite. She edited the sound without reference to the picture, as if it's a radio play. And then once she had it sounding right and the rhythms of the speech were correct, then she would give the sound to an assistant and say, put some picture to this. And Richie Marks, who was one of the editors with me on Apocalypse Now, he was her assistant. And suddenly, but he said it was a fantastic way of learning. And he would do the best job he could, and then he would give it back to her, obviously, and then she would refine it further. So every editor has different ways of approaching the work.
How about spotting music? Can you talk about the importance of music and where to put it? Because like those spotting sessions, right? It's hard to make the decision when to keep things silent.
Yes. The question is does the film have a musical base to it? American Graffiti, for instance, George Lucas's film, I did the sound on it, but George, in writing the script, defined what music should play with each scene. There were some exceptions where that didn't work, but by and large, that was set by George to begin with. On the other hand, I've worked on films where we have done a complete temp music score for it. And there the editor has a lot of control, saying where should music start, where should music end, what kind of music you should play. And I've done that on a number of films. It's a mysterious process. For instance, music in Star Wars it's very effective, but it's continuous, and it is always telling the audience what they need to feel.
What they need to feel, exactly.
What I prefer is an approach where the scene or a scene does not have music, and it begins to stir up emotions in the audience by virtue of the scene and the actors and how it's played. And then at a good moment, music can come in to partially resolve the sometimes contradictory emotions that have already been stirred up.
Yeah.
The music, for instance, in Godfather, after Sollozzo is killed, what we've just seen is a young man who didn't want to be part of the mafia, shooting two people, and also killing the dream that he expressed at the beginning, which is, I'm not part of. Now he's deeply in the family.
Yeah.
And it's a very emotional scene for all kinds of reasons with no music. Then once he drops the gun and exits, big music comes in. This was planned by Francis and Nino Rota. And what the music basically says is, don't worry, it's opera. He is now a character caught in the claws of an operatic dilemma, which are always magnified. It doesn't solve the problem, but it helps to move things forward without telling the audience during the main part of the scene what they should feel. So they're allowed to come up with their own feelings, and then the music comes in to help them. It's kind of like a hand that moves them along.
I had goosebumps for a moment when you were saying that story. I want to ask you about the future of editing. The artificial intelligence tools are like widely used nowadays for picture editing and things like that. And there is this, I don't remember the name, but there is actually an engine that already edited a feature film out of dailies. So how do you feel about the future of editing?
Yeah, well, those are big questions.
I know.
I was approached about 12 years ago by Google at the beginning of this process. And what they were developing, which has been developed since, what they identified was people who shoot movies about their vacation They shoot a lot of material and then they put it away and they say, I'll get to that someday. And they never do. And then they go on another vacation and eventually you have 10 vacations with nothing. So what through AI and other devices, what those programs do is say, don't worry, I'll give you an assembly. How do you want it? Do you want it to look like something from the 1940s, or do you want it science fiction-y? Or, you choose a theme, and then it analyzes the material and puts something together and adds, does all music and all of that. And then it allows you to make some few choices. I mean, this is happening not only in film, but in painting. There's now, an AI-created painting now just won first prize at some contest.
Exactly.
I'm glad I worked when I did.
I don't think it's going to be a huge problem for film editors.
Well, I don't know. I mean, it's so hard to predict. I mean, we're also, there's the whole other issue of deep fake videos, and you have people like the Coen brothers who edit their own films. And as did David Lean, and as did Charlie Chaplin, and Orson Welles, by his own account, did. So, and those are wonderful films, and there is no separate editor on those films, and it's certainly good. I believe that it's good to have a separate brain, at times almost like a psychiatrist, using the film as a Rorschach test with the director as the patient.
Like a mirror, right, where you can reflect your ideas.
And things can come out of that, as I said earlier, are not planned by anybody. Some other thing, like a Kulishovian moment, can arise that was never planned. And I have a preference for those moments. It's also on a practical level. Directors are always very busy with lots of other stuff than just this movie. They're developing other movies. They're doing promotion for the movie they made before, and who knows. So it's good, I think, to have some person 6 days a week thinking about the film without those other distractions. But I have no doubt that there will be a feature film, I think, as you indicate, that at least starts the assembly with that.
I have no doubt either, but at the same time, I think that people will want other human beings to edit films, at least to some extent.
I hope so.
Let's hope so, exactly. What do you think is the biggest misconception about editing that people have?
Well, on a simple level, it's that idea that the editor cuts out the bad bits, and that's kind of a knee-jerk reaction, because that's when people shoot their own home movies. If they edit them at all, they cut out the flash frames at the beginning and ending, or where the camera was not stable, and without question, that's what we do. But really, there's a certain truth in that simple statement, because what happens as you edit the film is you discover at higher and higher levels what is a bad bit. Something that on the surface looks to be very good, actually within the context of the whole is damaging. And even in a sense, its goodness at that part in the film is hurting everything else. So it's what I call the dilemma of Job, the man from the Bible, who was a good man. He did all the good things, and the Lord God kept punishing him. And sometimes I think of scenes in films that we eventually cut out. They tried to they did the best they could. They were good scenes, and yet we, the filmmakers, have a godlike view of the whole, and the scene is only thinking of itself. And so in the end, with sadness, we say, we take it out. So it was very good. There was nothing wrong with it, but it was a bad bit in the largest sense of that word. I remember Jerry Zucker, the director, who I worked with on 2 films, after the success of Airplane, he went home to his family in Minnesota, and they were very proud that Jerry had made a big success in Hollywood. And he had Thanksgiving dinner and everything. And then they said, well, what are you doing now? He said, well, I'm going back to finish whichever film, I forget which film it was. And they said correctly, well, but you finished shooting that. He said, yes, but now we're editing it, putting it. And it was like, what? What is editing? And he said, well, we shoot films out of order, and then we have to, like a jigsaw puzzle, we have to rearrange them, and then we have to make it as short as possible, all of the usual things. And they still were wondering. And he said, well, wait a minute, this was in the early days of VHS. So he got a tape of some other film, put it in the thing, and said, I'm going to snap my fingers every time there's a cut. And so they were watching whatever it was, and he kind of got into it, you know, like, and he turned and looked at them, and they were green, like they were sick, because he was showing them that film is a Frankenstein monster made out of dead parts put together, and somehow it gets alive. And at that point, he took the tape out and said, okay. So on a certain sense, when an ordinary person looks at a film, they accept it as an ongoing reality rather than of this kind of alchemical construction that we put together.
Yeah. I mean, on the first view, I'm the same. I just experienced the film, right? But yeah, I know what you mean. And like, it's always problematic for me to explain to people what actually editors do, right? It's still like, even though I've done it a few times.
I'm the same, even though I've been doing this for 6 decades. If a film is bad, then I will look at it and try to analyze editorially what's the problem here. So that's the only time I'll do a sort of forensic analysis of a film.
Have you ever thought about writing another book?
I am writing another book. I'm almost finished.
My goodness.
Hopefully it will be published next year.
That's a huge gift to the filmmaking community. So already, amazing. I was also wondering, have you ever thought more about directing? You have directed
yes.
a little bit, but I guess my question is, why haven't you directed more?
It's editing is a natural path, mostly, to directing. David Lean began as an editor, and then he became a director. You certainly, as an editor, know all of the tricks of cinematic construction. Yes, I directed Return to Oz, which we shot in 1984. It came out the next year. And I did try to get a number of projects off the ground after that, but the film was a commercial failure, and it also got some bad reviews because it was a sequel, in a sense, to the 1939 Wizard of Oz. And people went in expecting something like that, and it's not. It's very different. And after a while, financial things enter into it. You can only wait for so long. And I love editing. I love post-production and sound mixing and all of that. And so I went back to doing that. But, the experience certainly gave me a great deal of insight into the process, being in the director's chair.
You're someone who I feel is inspired by many mediums, creative mediums, right? So what do you feel are like the biggest synergies, I would say, for an editor? Things that you think are important to learn as an editor? How can you get ahead of the game? Acquire some kind of unfair advantage over other film editors, so to speak?
I don't know. Certainly have enough experience in life other than film school or film stuff. One of the dangers of film is that it can quickly become self-referential to previous films, which themselves were self-referential to about cinema. And, that makes us understand that cinema is barely 100 years old, 110, 20 years old. It's basically a single long human lifetime that we've been doing this. And to read a lot, the peculiarity is that I don't watch very much television. And in fact, when I'm working on a film, it's very hard for me to look at another film because if it's a good film, I want to steal things from it to put into the film I'm working on, which may not be the right thing. And if it's a bad film, I see all of those bad things as things that we're doing too. And that makes me depressed. So I try to separate it out. That's a non-answer, but it's as close as I can get.
No, that's perfect, yeah. That's perfect. How do you protect the director from that initial feeling? Because I think very, very often directors, when they see the first cut, they feel insecure of the film. So how do you deal with that?
My father was an artist, and he studied with somebody who had studied with Chagall. He had asked the sitter to come back 11 times because it just wasn't working. And finally, he said, he returned the money that had been advanced and said, I'm sorry, it's just not working. I can't do it for whatever reason. And then he sat and looked at the painting and said, okay, it's a failure, similar to this idea of the first assembly. And he said, is there anything I like about it? Well, I like the way the light comes around the back of his neck where his collar hits the neck. Yeah, that's good. And so I'm going to forget that it's a portrait, he said, and I'm going to try to trap whatever that quality was and extend it into the rest of the painting, which he did. And it became a very famous painting. Does it resemble the goal was to resemble the person sitting there, and did it or did it not? That's frequently a story I will tell to directors who are depressed about the first assembly. Okay, let's identify what's really good. There are many good things in here, and then why are they good, and how can we extend their goodness into the rest of the film by massaging it, basically. It's the editor at that point is like a therapeutic massagist, massaging all these pixels and sprockets to make it better.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
Very good questions, by the way.
Thank you. I'm now the proud owner of the signed copy of In the Blink of an Eye. Look at that. Huge thanks to nofilmschool.com and the CAMERIMAGE Film Festival for giving me this opportunity.